When you think of Korea today, it's pretty much a tale of two completely different places, right? On one side, you've got this global cultural and technological powerhouse. And on the other, one of the most isolated, most secretive nations on the entire planet. So how on earth did one country, one people, end up as two totally separate worlds? Well, let's dig in and find out.
The contrast is just wild. In the South, you've got the incredible energy of K-pop, cutting-edge technology, and in the North, a closed-off dictatorial state. But here's the thing to remember. Underneath all those differences, they share the exact same language, the same culture, and literally thousands of years of history together.
So how did this happen? How did a single people living on one peninsula wind up on such radically different paths? Well, the answer, it's not simple at all. And to really get it, we've got to go way back, long before that border was ever even a thought. Okay, so we're going to rewind the clock to the late 19th century. This was a time when these massive empires, we're talking China, Japan, and Russia, all looked at the Korean peninsula and saw a huge prize. It was this strategic gateway, a key piece in a massive geopolitical chess match they were all playing.
You see, for most of its history, Korea was this one unified kingdom. People often called it the Hermit Kingdom because it deliberately tried to keep foreign powers out, to protect its own culture and sovereignty. But the world was changing fast, and that isolation, it just wasn't gonna last.
What's really crazy here is just how fast this all happened. Look at this. In 1873, Japan shows up with warships and forces Korea to open its ports. So China, not wanting to get left out, moves its own troops in. This rivalry just explodes into the Sino-Japanese War, which Japan wins. Then Russia tries to step in, which leads to the Russo-Japanese War. And guess what? Japan wins again, knocking out all its rivals. In just over 30 years, Korea's independence was completely gone.
Yeah, and we're not talking about polite diplomatic meetings here. To really cement their power, the Japanese were absolutely ruthless. In 1895, they took the incredible, shocking step of assassinating the Korean queen, Queen Min, right inside the royal palace. It was a raw, brutal message designed to intimidate anyone who dared resist them.
So, by 1910, that was it. The game was over. Japan officially annexed Korea, and this kicked off a 35-year period of colonial rule that would completely and painfully reshape Korean society.
So what's the first thing they do? They systematically dismantle any and all political freedom. The right to speak your mind, to publish a newspaper, even just to gather in a group, all of it, gone. And any Korean guerrilla fighters who tried to resist were hunted down, forced to flee for their lives into China.
And then, of course, comes the economic takeover. Japan pushed down Korean businesses to make way for their own companies. They seized enormous amounts of farmland and sold it off for cheap to Japanese settlers. Korean farmers were then forced to grow rice that was shipped off to Japan, while they themselves were left eating cheaper imported grains.
But honestly, maybe the worst part of it all was the attempt to just erase Korean identity itself. They shut down Korean schools, they banned the teaching of Korean history, and even the Korean language. They forced people to take Japanese names and even made them worship at Japanese Shinto shrines. This was a systematic effort to destroy the very soul of a nation. But even with all of this oppression, the Korean spirit, it wasn't broken, not by a long shot. On March 1st, 1919, a massive, totally peaceful independence movement just erupted across the entire country. Millions of Koreans took part. The Japanese response, though, was swift and unbelievably brutal. They sent in the military, and tens of thousands of Koreans were killed, wounded, or arrested.
And that brutal crackdown, it just poured fuel on the fire for independence. In the aftermath, Korean leaders got together and formed a provisional government in exile, based in Shanghai. Its first president was a man named Syngman Rhee, and you're going to want to remember that name because it becomes very, very important later on.
All right, let's jump forward to 1945. World War II is finally ending, Japan is defeated. For Koreans, after 35 long, painful years, this should have been it, right? Liberation? But nope. Instead, the decisions of foreign powers were, once again, about to decide their fate.
So here's the thing. The division of Korea wasn't some grand plan. It was more like a series of hurried, pragmatic decisions that just kind of happened. At big conferences, the Allies promised Korea independence, but the language was super vague, like in due course. They even floated this idea of a trusteeship, where they'd basically manage the country for a while. Then, bam, in the final days of the war, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan and sends troops pouring into Korea. The U.S., desperate to stop a full Soviet takeover, scrambles for a last-minute solution.
And get this, 2 young American officers were basically told, hey, you've got 30 minutes. Find a dividing line on this map. Go. So they looked at a National Geographic map and picked the 38th parallel of latitude, mostly because it cut the country pretty neatly in half. It had nothing to do with geography or culture or politics. It was just an arbitrary line, meant to be a temporary military convenience. The Soviets handle the Japanese surrender north of the line, the Americans handle it to the south. Simple as that. It was never, ever meant to be permanent.
Yeah, about that temporary line, it didn't stay temporary for long. As the ashes of World War II cooled, the new tensions of the Cold War were heating up. And Korea, a country that had absolutely nothing to do with this new ideological fight, suddenly found itself on the absolute front line.
So in the North and the South, the 2 superpowers immediately got to work basically creating mirror images of themselves. In the North, the Soviets set up a communist government pretty quickly, and they installed a former anti-Japanese guerrilla fighter named Kim Il-sung as its leader. Meanwhile, in the South, the U.S. military refused to recognize the existing Korean government and instead threw its backing behind the fiercely anti-communist Syngman Rhee. Yep, the same guy from the government in exile.
Now, they talked about it. For years, the US and the Soviets had meetings and discussions about unifying Korea. But with 2 totally opposing systems already taking root, and just this deep, deep mistrust between the superpowers, they could never agree on a plan. That temporary military line was rapidly turning into concrete and barbed wire.
The final nail in the coffin really came in 1947. The newly formed United Nations stepped in and proposed a solution. Let's hold nationwide elections for a single Korean government. But the Soviets, they knew their communist candidate would probably lose a fair election, so they refused to even let UN observers into their northern zone. So the elections went ahead, but only in the South. In August 1948, the Republic of Korea, or South Korea, was born. And just 1 month later, the North responded by declaring its own state, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The division, born from a temporary line on a map, was now official.
And so, a line drawn on a map in 30 minutes as a temporary military fix became one of the most heavily fortified, dangerous borders in the entire world, splitting a nation and millions of families in 2. From being a prize in an imperial game, to a victim of colonial rule, to a pawn in the Cold War, the story of Korea's division is a real tragedy of outside forces, which leaves us with the big question that hangs over the peninsula to this day. After all this time, will one Korea ever exist again?